What if I told you that one of the most successful men in modern history built his empire not on technology, but on a psychological manipulation technique so powerful that his own employees had a name for it? They called it the reality distortion field. And before you dismiss this as corporate folklore or exaggerated legend, understand this. Carl Jung predicted exactly how this worked 70 years before Steve Jobs ever walked into a boardroom. What Jung discovered about the human psyche reveals something deeply unsettling about influence, control, and the invisible forces that make us abandon our own reality to adopt someone else's. And here's what nobody talks about. You're not immune to this. In fact, someone is using this exact technique on you right now and you don't even realize it. But by the end of this journey into the darkest corners of psychological influence, you'll not only see it clearly, you'll understand why you've been so vulnerable to it your whole life. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see power, persuasion, and your own mind. Picture this. January 9th, 2007, Moscone Center in San Francisco. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage wearing his signature black turtleneck and jeans. The audience doesn't know it yet, but they're about to witness one of the most masterful displays of psychological manipulation in modern history. Jobs is about to announce the iPhone. But here's what makes this moment psychologically fascinating. The iPhone, at that exact moment, barely works. The prototypes are unstable. They crash constantly. The development team has been working around the clock just to create a demo sequence that won't fail on stage. Any rational person looking at the state of the product would say it's not ready, it's not finished, it might not even be possible. But Jobs walks out with absolute certainty radiating from every pore. He doesn't present the iPhone as a work in progress. He doesn't hedge. He doesn't use qualifiers like "we hope" or "we're planning" or "eventually this might." No, he presents it as inevitable, as already real, as the future that has already arrived and you're just catching up to it. And here's where it gets psychologically disturbing. Within minutes, the entire audience believes him completely, totally. They don't just think the iPhone will be good. They know it will revolutionize everything. They can see it. They can feel it. Their own doubts, their own critical thinking, their own assessment of reality, all of it dissolves. They've entered what his employees called the reality distortion field. But this wasn't an isolated incident. This was Steve Jobs' primary tool of influence, and he used it everywhere. With investors, with employees, with partners, with the public. And the results were consistently impossible. Engineers would tell him something couldn't be done in the time frame he demanded. Physically impossible. The laws of physics and programming wouldn't allow it. And Jobs would look at them with that intense, unblinking stare and say, "I need it by Friday." No argument, no negotiation, just absolute conviction that reality would bend to his will. And here's the disturbing part. They would do it. They would go back to their desks, work through the night, and somehow, impossibly, they would deliver. Not because the laws of physics changed, but because something in their psychology changed. One famous story captures this perfectly. A senior engineer once spent weeks explaining to Jobs why a particular feature was impossible. Impossible. He had run the calculations. He had consulted with other experts. He had exhausted every avenue. It simply could not be done with current technology. Jobs listened to the entire explanation with that characteristic intensity. And when the engineer finished, Jobs simply said, "Don't be afraid. You can do it." And he walked away. That engineer later said that in that moment his entire relationship with reality shifted, not because Jobs provided new information or solved the technical problem, but because Jobs spoke with such absolute certainty that the impossible became possible, that the engineer's own sense of what was real became malleable. Within 2 weeks, that engineer had found a solution. The feature shipped. Now, most people hear stories like this and think, wow, what an inspiring leader, what vision, what ability to push people beyond their limits. And yes, that's one interpretation, but Carl Jung would have seen something much darker, something more primal, something that reveals a fundamental vulnerability in human consciousness that most people never recognize. Because what Steve Jobs was doing, whether he knew it or not, was exploiting a psychological mechanism that Jung called participation mystique. Participation mystique is a French term Jung borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. It describes a state of consciousness where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, where you lose your individual identity and merge with another person's psyche, another person's reality, another person's will. Jung observed this in indigenous cultures, where tribal members would so completely identify with their totem animal or their chief that they literally experienced the world through that merged identity. They didn't think like the totem. They were the totem. The separation between subject and object collapsed. And here's what Jung realized that's absolutely crucial. This isn't some primitive state that modern humans have evolved beyond. This is a fundamental feature of the unconscious that operates in all of us all the time. We participate mystically with our parents as children, absorbing their reality as our own. We participate mystically with our cultures, our nations, our tribes. We participate mystically with charismatic leaders, celebrities, influencers. We lose our individual reality and merge with theirs, and most terrifyingly, we don't realize we're doing it. We think we're thinking independently. We think we're maintaining our own assessment of reality, but we're not. We've been absorbed into someone else's field. This is what Steve Jobs was a master at creating. The reality distortion field wasn't metaphorical. It was a literal description of participation mystique in action. When Jobs entered a room with that absolute conviction, that unshakable certainty, that total lack of doubt, he created a psychological gravitational field so strong that other people's individual consciousness got pulled into orbit around his. They stopped assessing reality through their own faculties. They started assessing reality through his eyes. His certainty became their certainty. His vision became their vision. His impossible became their possible. But Jung identified a second mechanism at work here, and this one is even more disturbing. He called it psychic inflation. This is what happens when an individual identifies so completely with an archetype, with a transpersonal energy pattern, that they lose sight of their human limitations. They become inflated beyond their mortal self. They become possessed by the God within. And here's the key. When someone is in a state of psychic inflation, when they genuinely believe they are channeling something superhuman, something destiny ordained, something beyond mere human capacity, that inflation is contagious. It infects everyone around them. Steve Jobs, by all accounts, genuinely believed he was special. Not just talented, not just smart, special in an almost messianic sense. He believed he could see the future. He believed he was chosen to transform humanity through technology. He believed the normal rules didn't apply to him. This wasn't just arrogance or confidence. This was full psychic inflation. He had merged his ego with the archetype of the revolutionary, the visionary, the magician who transforms base matter into gold. And when you're in the presence of someone experiencing that level of inflation, if you're not psychologically grounded in your own reality, you get swept up in it. You start to believe they really are special. You start to participate in their mythology. You enter the field. But here's where this gets personally relevant to you, sitting here watching this right now, because Steve Jobs is dead. Apple's boardrooms are not your daily reality. So why does this matter? It matters because the reality distortion field isn't unique to Steve Jobs. It's a psychological technology. And once you understand how it works, you start seeing it everywhere. Your charismatic boss who makes you doubt your own assessment of what's realistic. The influencer who creates such a strong reality around their lifestyle that you feel your own life is inadequate. The partner who seems so certain about their version of events that you start questioning your own memory. The political leader who speaks with such conviction that you abandon your own analysis and adopt theirs. They're all using the same mechanism. They're all creating a field of psychological gravity that pulls you out of your own reality and into theirs. And the most dangerous part? The people who are best at this often don't even know they're doing it. Jobs probably didn't wake up thinking, today I'm going to exploit participation mystique and psychic inflation to manipulate my team. He was likely just being himself, but that's what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. Conscious manipulation you can defend against, but unconscious psychological mechanisms operating through charismatic individuals, that bypasses all your defenses. It operates below your awareness. You think you're making independent assessments, but you're already in the field. Jung warned about this extensively in his later work. He saw what happened in Nazi Germany when millions of rational, educated people entered into participation mystique with Hitler, when they lost their individual reality and merged with his vision, when his psychic inflation became a mass psychosis. And Jung's warning was clear. This can happen anytime, anywhere, with anyone charismatic enough to create that field and anyone unconscious enough to get pulled into it. It happened with Jobs and Apple. It happens in startups with visionary founders. It happens in relationships with narcissistic partners. It happens in movements, in religions, in political campaigns. The mechanism is always the same. So how do you defend against it? How do you maintain your own relationship with reality when you're in the presence of someone operating in the reality distortion field? This is where we move from analysis to practice, because understanding the mechanism intellectually is useless if you can't apply it in the moment. And the moment is tricky because when you're in the field, you don't realize you're in the field. That's the whole point. So you need a structured practice, a psychological technology of your own to maintain your sovereignty. Here's your 3-step workshop for maintaining reality contact when you're in the presence of someone else's distortion field. Step 1. The pause of sovereignty. When someone makes a statement with absolute certainty, especially a statement about what's possible or impossible, what will happen or won't happen, what's real or isn't real, you must create a deliberate pause before responding or agreeing. In that pause, you ask yourself one question. Am I assessing this claim through my own faculties, or am I feeling pressure to adopt their certainty? This is harder than it sounds because the pressure is subtle. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like clarity. It feels like suddenly seeing what they see. That's the field working. The pause breaks the automatic participation. It creates a gap where your individual consciousness can reassert itself. Practice this now. Think of the last time someone said something with total conviction and you immediately agreed. Was that really your assessment? Or were you participating in theirs? Step 2. The reality anchor. You need an external reference point that exists outside the field. When Jobs told engineers something was possible by Friday, those engineers needed to anchor to objective reality, the code they had, the time available, the physical limitations of the hardware. But they didn't. They anchored to his certainty instead. Your reality anchor can be data, it can be trusted advisors outside the field, it can be your own documented past experience, but it must be external to the immediate psychological gravity. Write down your assessment before entering conversations with people who create strong fields. Document your analysis, because once you're in the field, your memory becomes plastic. You'll start to remember things the way they remember them. Your anchor prevents that drift. What's your reality anchor? Who or what in your life helps you maintain your own assessment when someone else's certainty is overwhelming? Step 3. The integration check. After you've exited the field, after the meeting is over, after the charismatic person has left the room, you must do an integration check. Ask yourself, what did I commit to while I was in their presence? Does that still make sense now that I'm alone? This is where the real damage of the reality distortion field becomes visible. Because people commit to impossible things, unrealistic timelines, unhealthy relationships, poor investments, all while in the field, and then they're stuck executing those commitments in actual reality where the field doesn't operate. How many times have you agreed to something in someone's presence that seemed completely reasonable in that moment, but the second you left, you thought, wait, what did I just agree to? That's the field dissipating. The integration check catches this before you waste months executing someone else's distorted reality. But here's the deeper Jungian insight that makes this whole psychological mechanism even more profound. The people who are most susceptible to other people's reality distortion fields are the people who haven't developed their own. If you don't have a strong relationship with your own inner authority, with your own sense of what's real and possible, with your own psychic ground, then you become like a planet without gravity. You just drift into the orbit of whoever has the strongest field. This is why Jung was so insistent on the process of individuation, on developing a conscious relationship with your own unconscious, on integrating your own shadow, on knowing yourself at the deepest level. It's not just abstract spiritual development, it's psychological self-defense. Because here's what Jobs' employees eventually discovered. Those who maintained their own reality while still collaborating with his vision, those who could say, no, that's actually not possible, but here's what is possible that achieves the same goal. Those were the ones who survived and thrived, the ones who completely merged with his field, who lost their own assessment of reality entirely. Those burned out. They accomplished impossible things, yes, but at what cost? Their health, their relationships, their sense of self. They became extensions of Jobs' will rather than individuals in collaboration with it. And when the field finally collapsed, when Jobs died, many of them were lost because they had never developed their own psychological gravity. This is the shadow side of charismatic leadership that nobody talks about. We celebrate the Steve Jobs of the world for their vision, their intensity, their ability to make the impossible happen. And yes, that's real. The iPhone is real. Apple's transformation of multiple industries is real. But we don't talk about the psychological casualties, the people who got pulled so completely into someone else's reality that they lost their own. The relationships destroyed because someone brought that same reality distortion field home and couldn't turn it off. The mental health crises that emerge when you realize you've spent years executing someone else's vision and have no idea what your own vision even is. Jung saw this pattern repeat throughout history. The great leaders, the visionaries, the revolutionaries, they all create these fields and they accomplish extraordinary things. But they also leave a wake of psychological damage in people who never learn to maintain their own reality contact. And the tragedy is that it's not even necessarily the leader's fault. Jobs didn't force anyone to abandon their own reality. He just was so absolutely certain of his own that he created a gravitational field. The responsibility for staying grounded, for maintaining sovereignty, for not participating mystically to the point of self-loss, that responsibility belongs to each individual. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Where are you currently in someone else's reality distortion field? Whose certainty have you adopted as your own? Whose vision are you executing without ever checking if it aligns with your own? Whose version of what's possible or impossible Have you internalized to the point that you can't even remember what you originally thought? This isn't about rejecting influence or refusing to be inspired by others. It's about maintaining the capacity to distinguish between inspiration and absorption, between collaboration and dissolution. Think about your work. Is there someone whose assessment of reality you've stopped questioning? Not because they've repeatedly proven correct, but because their certainty is so strong that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. That's the field. Think about your relationships. Is there someone whose version of events you've adopted, even when it contradicts your own memory? Someone whose interpretation of situations becomes the truth simply because they state it with enough conviction? That's the field. Think about your consumption of information. Are there voices you follow whose worldview you've internalized so completely that you can't even access your own analysis anymore? That's the field. The reality distortion field isn't evil. It's not even necessarily bad. It's a psychological technology. Like any technology, it can be used for creation or destruction. Jobs used it to create revolutionary products, but he also used it, consciously or not, to control people, to override their reality, to make them doubt their own perceptions. And the people who worked with him most successfully were the ones who learned to benefit from his vision without losing their own ground. They learned to dance at the edge of the field without getting pulled in completely. This is the art of psychological sovereignty in the modern world, because we're all constantly bombarded with reality distortion fields. Social media is one giant overlapping series of fields. Every influencer, every brand, every ideology is projecting a reality and inviting you to participate in it. And if you're not anchored in your own, if you haven't done the Jungian work of knowing yourself, of integrating your shadow, of developing your own relationship with the unconscious, then you're just drifting from field to field, never sure which thoughts are yours and which are absorbed, never certain if you're living your life or performing someone else's script. And here's the final twist that brings us full circle. Steve Jobs himself was likely caught in his own reality distortion field. Jung called this the inflation trap. When you're so identified with the archetype, when you're so merged with the God energy flowing through you, you lose sight of your humanity. You start to believe your own mythology. Jobs believed he could control everything, including his own cancer. He famously refused conventional treatment for months, believing he could cure himself through alternative means, through sheer force of will, through that same reality distortion that had worked in every other area of his life. But cancer doesn't care about your certainty. Reality doesn't ultimately bend to will, no matter how strong, and Jobs' inability to distinguish between the domains where his field worked and the domains where it didn't may have cost him his life. This is Jung's warning about inflation. Eventually, reality reasserts itself. Eventually, the thing you can't control arrives. Eventually, the distortion field collapses. And if you've built your entire identity on being the person who controls reality, on being special, on being beyond normal limitations, that collapse is devastating. Jobs' death was tragic, not just because the world lost a visionary, but because it revealed the ultimate limitation of the reality distortion field. You can distort perception. You can influence people. You can accomplish extraordinary things, but you can't actually change reality itself. And if you've lost the ability to tell the difference, that's when the inflation becomes fatal. So where does this leave you? Right here, right now, armed with awareness that most people never develop. You now see the mechanism. You understand how participation mystique works. You recognize psychic inflation when you encounter it. You know the 3 steps to maintain your sovereignty. But knowledge without application is just entertainment. The question is, what are you going to do with this? Because I promise you, tomorrow you're going to encounter someone's reality distortion field. Maybe your boss, maybe your partner, maybe a video that auto-plays after this one. And in that moment, you'll have a choice. You can recognize it, pause, anchor, and maintain your own reality contact. Or you can do what most people do, merge, participate, and wake up 6 months later wondering how you ended up here. The truth Jung spent his entire life trying to communicate is this: consciousness is hard work. Maintaining your own reality requires constant vigilance. It's easier to merge, it's comfortable to participate, it's seductive to let someone else's certainty replace your doubt. But that ease, that comfort, that seduction, it comes at the cost of yourself. And once you've given that away enough times, getting it back becomes nearly impossible. If this journey through the dark psychology of influence has revealed something you needed to see, then you already know this isn't just information, this is initiation. You can't unsee this now. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to practice sovereignty or surrender it. And that's why this work matters. That's why Jung's insights aren't just academic psychology. They're survival tools for navigating a world full of people who, like Jobs, are creating powerful distortion fields, mostly unconsciously. So here's what I ask. Don't just watch this and move on. Subscribe to this process of continuous awakening, because every video is another descent into the mechanisms of the psyche that control you until you make them conscious. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Not to be contrarian or cynical, but to give them the same gift you just received, the ability to see the invisible forces shaping their reality, and most importantly, do the work. Use the 3 steps, practice the pause, maintain your anchor, do your integration checks, because the reality distortion field is real, it's powerful, it's everywhere, and the only defense is consciousness itself. In the end, Steve Jobs' legacy isn't just the iPhone or the Mac or the revolution in personal computing. His legacy is a perfect case study in how psychological mechanisms that Jung identified in laboratories and ancient myths operate in modern corporate boardrooms and shape our entire civilization. And the question that legacy poses to each of us is simple but terrifying. Am I living in my own reality, or am I participating mystically in someone else's? Your answer to that question will determine everything that comes next. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. And above all, choose for yourself.